And good morning to all, and welcome to our first panel session of the forum. My name is Peter Varghese. I'm the Chancellor of the University of Queensland. So this morning we've had two very thought-provoking presentations, a contemporary analysis from the Governor, and then a very erudite scene setter from Professor Philip Petit on the what, the why, and the how of democracy. And you could well ask, between the two of them, what more is there to discuss about democracy? Well, in this session, we want to take the broad framing that our two speakers this morning provided and apply it to the global challenges to democracy. And we have a very eminent panel to help us do that. I won't go through each of their biographies because they're in the program notes, but let me briefly introduce. On my immediate right is Professor Hugh White, who's the Emeritus Professor of Strategic Studies at the Australian National University and a former Senior Defence Department official and Prime Ministerial Advisor and an old friend and colleague. Next to Hugh is Professor Deborah Cobb-Clark, who is Professor of Economics at the University of Sydney. And on the far right is Professor Quentin Grafton, who's Professor of Economics and an ARC Laureate Fellow at ANU. So the discussion in this panel will focus on three broad topics. Hugh will address the geopolitical big picture, including whether we face, I hope he addresses this, whether we face a contest between an alliance of democracies and an axis of autocracy, about which we're hearing more and more. Deborah will explore democracy and inequality, including inequality and intergenerational fairness. And Quentin will focus on democracy, the environment, and sustainability. All of them, I hope, will not just admire the problem, but also canvass some steps that we can take to strengthen democracy. And in locating democracy in a global context, I think it is humbling to note, as the Governor did and as our program notes do, that less than 8% of the world's population live in what could be described as full democracies. And I think it's also the case that while most people in this room think of democracy in terms of secular liberal democratic tradition, which has essentially shaped the Australian experience and the Anglosphere experience as well, globally, democracy comes in many guises, including illiberal democracies and elected autocracies. And as we've seen in many countries, there's no guarantee that once established, liberal democracies stay that way. Now, the format of our discussion will be that each of our panel members will sequentially speak for no more than 10 minutes, and then we will open it up for questions and wrap up, I hope, just short of 1 hour. So I'm going to ask Hugh to kick off our discussion. Hugh, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Peter. It's a great pleasure to be here. Thanks, Christy, for the invitation. Well, of course, Trump demands attention this week, but I'm not going to talk about Trump. I'm going to step back and ask about how the crisis in global and regional order, which focuses so much attention these days, affects the future of democracy. The connection between international order and democracy is, of course, an important one. Ever since democracies emerged, and indeed you could go all the way back to the Greeks, as Philip did before tea, there's always been a sense of fragility in the face of authoritarian regimes surrounding. The question as to whether or not the world is safe for democracy has been an issue. It was an issue long before Woodrow Wilson used that phrase in connection with America's approach to the world it found itself in. There's always been a question in, can democracy survive and flourish anywhere if it does not flourish everywhere? Now, in the post-Cold War era, we've had a particular take on that question because we've had an opportunity for new hope and confidence, more hope and confidence perhaps than the democratic world has ever had before, that democracy would flourish everywhere and therefore could flourish in our some democratic homelands unthreatened. And that was because at the end of the Cold War, what appeared to have happened was the emergence of a liberal democratically framed global order, supported, upheld, one might say enforced, by overwhelmingly preponderant American power. And, perhaps equally important, it appeared to be accepted by all the other powers in the world, at least the major powers. Only the rogue states, so-called, held out. And they didn't seem strong enough to pose a significant challenge. And hence, of course, the end of history, that the big debate was over and liberal democracy had won. And there was some good empirical support for that view of what was happening in the world, because we did indeed see in the 90s a remarkable wave of democratization. In Asia, Indonesia, South Korea, Taiwan made their transitions, and of course in Eastern Europe, a very broad wave of transitions to democracy as well. Well, suffice to say that from the perspective of today, those hopes were dashed. And in part that's because of disappointment in the way in which democracy has progressed in a range of individual countries, including countries in the West. Brexit in the UK, recidivism in a number of important European countries, and of course Trump in the United States. But I'd like to argue that there's also been another very big source of our anxiety, has been the crisis that has engulfed that post-Cold War order. That crisis has two drivers. The first is that it turned out that the idea of a liberal democratic global order and the idea that that would lead progressively and perhaps quite quickly to democracy spreading even to countries like China that hadn't signed up to it already, that turned out not to be accepted by a number of very powerful states, and in particular China and Russia, but some others as well. And we can see by how many people turned up at the BRICS meeting in Russia a week, 2 weeks ago, to see that it's not just a Russia-China problem. And the second is that United States power turns out not to be as preponderant as we thought. Now, those major powers now seek a new global order to overturning the order that appeared to emerge at the end of the Cold War. And that has generated the most acute crisis in global order since the collapse of our hopes for a post-Cold War, a post-World War II order, what you might call the San Francisco model framed around the UN, and the emergence of the bipolar Cold War order. Now that generates very substantial fears in the West, if I can use that generalised term rather loosely. There's fear that we are facing a new authoritarian hegemony, that the access of authoritarians will take the place of the liberal democratic hegemony, the unipolar order that we thought had emerged at the end of the Cold War, and it will be replaced by an authoritarian hegemony, which would threaten democracies in countries like ours. And that rather Wagnerian sort of Goethe-Demmeringish view of what's at stake in the great power rivalries that we now see unfolding between supporters of the old post-Cold War order and its rivals amongst the discontented, the axis of authoritarians. That frames our view, the scale of those stakes, the concern that the survival of our own democracy is at stake, frames our view as to how we should respond to the challenge to global order which we now face. It makes us think that this is like 1938 or 1939 or like 1947, that everything about the way our society works is at stake in preserving the post-Cold War order as clearly, as strongly as we could, that we should do whatever it takes, including, if necessary, going to war to do so. Now, I believe the threat to the post-Cold War order is very real, and it's not because of Trump. It's because of a fundamental shift in the distribution of wealth and power, which was what was really happening in the 80s and 90s and 2000s. Much more important than the collapse of the Soviet Union, the end of the Cold War, was the most profound shift in the distribution of wealth and power that we've seen since the Industrial Revolution, and the fastest shift in the distribution of wealth and power in human history. And what that means is that the West simply cannot impose the liberal democratic hegemony on the countries we thought we could impose it on at the end of the Cold War. The costs and the risks are just too high. The costs because, particularly in China, but also in some others, the scale of resources they can bring to bear to the contest is too great. And the risks, because we are living in an age of nuclear weapons, we allowed ourselves to forget that for a while. One of the things Ukraine has done is remind us that nuclear weapons must always, as they exist, sit at the centre of our strategic calculations. One of the things Ukraine showed us is the real limits to what we can and are willing to do in the face of a risk of nuclear war. My view, I won't give you the full argument, is that I don't believe the post-Cold War order, as we've conceived it and as we've loved it, can or will be sustained. A new order is coming. The question is, what will it be? The fear, as I've mentioned, is it will be a new authoritarian unipolar order, masterminded by China, and that will threaten everything that we hold dear about the way our societies work. I don't think that's going to happen. It's not going to happen because whilst there's been a radical shift in the distribution of wealth and power away from, broadly speaking, US unipolarity, what that's produced is not a monopoly of the major forms of power by China, or anybody else for that matter, but a diffuse distribution of wealth and power around the world, which is going to make it impossible for any one power or group to dominate. This is not an unfamiliar situation. Multipolarity has been the norm in international systems through history. And I think what we're going to end up with is a multipolar global order, which is quite diverse ideologically. There'll be democracies, there'll be autocracies, there'll be all sorts of different categories in between. And that will be true not just globally, but also in Asia. Asia will not be dominated by China, apart from anything else, because India's there, and Indonesia, and a number of other powerful states. So we are going to live in a multipolar world, and an ideologically diverse multipolar world, and an ideologically diverse multipolar Asia, which is much less dire for the future of our own democracy and the democracies in countries like ours than we might have feared from the axis of authoritarianism model. It's not going to be as easy for us as the post-Cold War vision was, because that was gorgeous if it had worked. But it's not entirely unfamiliar. This kind of multipolarity, ideologically diverse multipolarity, it was Europe in the 19th century. It was the vision of world order that was embodied in San Francisco in 1945. It can be made to work. It's got to be made to work, and it's hard work making it work, but it can be made to work. And the experience of the 20th century, as well as of the 19th century, suggests that our democracies can survive as democracies in that kind of multipolar order if we play our cards right. But it will be different, and it will be more challenging, especially, I might say, for Australia and Asia, because for the first time since European settlement of this continent, Asia will no longer be dominated by our Anglo-Saxon mates. And we will have to change in order to adapt to that in ways that I think we fear. I think we fear more than we need to. We don't want to forget that we have changed a lot before. We abandoned white Australia, for example. The bigger threat to our security is not from the emergence of that kind of multipolar regional and global order, but the mistaken effort to perpetuate the post-Cold War order out of exaggerated fears of what that multipolar order would deliver. In particular, from our efforts to try and preserve US primacy in Asia as a foundation of the regional and global order. And that leads us to accept, and leads some of us even to embrace, the prospect of war as the necessary price to preserve US primacy in this part of the world and globally. I think we are far too willing to embrace that prospect and far too unreflective about what war between great powers in a nuclear age means. Those of us old enough to remember the Cold War shouldn't be surprised by that. It is worth bearing in mind that when you hear our political leaders talk about deterrence, that's what they mean. They mean a willingness to go to war to preserve the US-led order, which we know and love. So, to me, the essence for us of preserving our democracy as best we can is not to try and resist change in the international order, but to try and manage it, contribute to managing it, and preparing ourselves to survive and flourish and remain democratic in a different, but not unmanageably different, international order from the one we've known and loved. The primary determinant of the survival and health of our democracy, here and I might say elsewhere, depends not therefore on preventing any shift in the international system, but in delivering what democracy must always deliver: good leaders and good policy. Including, I might say, good policies to navigate the kinds of strategic challenges I've so briefly sketched, and the challenges that my two esteemed colleagues on this panel will be talking about: social, economic, environmental challenges. Now, I'm not a political scientist, but it does seem to me that a big part of how effectively our politics can deliver good leaders and good politics is how well our political parties function as providers of leaders and providers of politics. And on the evidence of the last 25 years, there's a lot of improvement to be made. Thank you.
So I've been asked to speak about inequality and the nature of democracy. And I'm going to start with the proposition that when we think about the impact that inequality might be having on the enduring nature of democracy and the stability of democracy, that we need to consider the impact that it's having on the social contract and perceptions of fairness. And we also need to apply an intergenerational lens. So I'm going to try and do that. And as an economist, I couldn't resist showing you some pictures. I don't actually have equations today, sadly, but I do have some pictures. So I want to start with a question, the proposition, not all inequality is fair. Not all inequality is bad, but what really matters is what we think is fair and what we think is not fair. And so fair inequality is typically defined as, what happens when you have a meritocratic society and people are rewarded on the basis of their merit, what they contribute, their abilities, their skills, etc., how hard they work. And unfair inequality is driven by the things that happen to you as a result of the circumstances of your birth, things that are outside of your control. Equality of opportunity then becomes about trying to offset those differences in unfair inequality. Those things that are attributable to luck, but not necessarily the differences in outcomes for which individuals are responsible. So we're trying to equalize opportunity, not outcomes. And how people see this, the importance of luck versus effort and getting ahead in life and how well their children do and how much they succeed, is important because, in part, it dictates preferences for redistribution. And if you think about what a government's doing, if you go back to your what are the key roles of government, one of them is tax and transfer, redistribute between the haves and the have-nots, and how people perceive which category you end up in matters for how much people are prepared to support redistribution. Inequality also matters because it's linked to economic opportunity. So I just want to make one point that global inequality is changing, right? And the peak here in this graph is about 1980. And what this is just showing you is if you take worldwide global inequality, what proportion of it is across societies or across countries and what proportion is within. And we reached a peak in about 1980 or so, and what's becoming increasingly important is inequality within society. So if you think about this, I mean, up to about 1980, the big issue was us versus them. And now the big issue is us versus us. And you can sort of imagine that that's going to have implications for a way society comes together to govern itself. Inequality matters because essentially what it's doing is, if you think about the socioeconomic spectrum as a ladder, this is, an analogy that gets made often, inequality is pulling the rungs of those ladders apart. And it just makes it harder to get from one point to the next because the distance you have to travel is so much greater. President Obama called restoring economic opportunity as a defining challenge of our times. I agree with that. I think we'd all agree with that. And in some of the post-US election assessments that I've seen, people are sort of pointing to the fact that the Obama administration didn't really deliver that kind of change for many people, or not in a way that was easily felt. And so in many, particularly Southern Black US communities, the civil rights movement was a long, long time ago, 2 generations ago now. And the question is, has the current system of government, has the Democratic Party been delivering on this sort of promise? Worldwide, the vast majority of people believe that inequality is the greatest threat to democracy. Not a threat, the greatest threat. So I wanted to just put some Australian context on this, and I've taken, look, the reality is there's no single number that I can show you that captures inequality. Economic inequality tends to get focused on a lot, by which we usually mean income and wealth. And so I'm going to do that. I've taken these graphs from the Productivity Commission because you can get all kinds of numbers depending on what you do, and I happen to trust the Productivity Commission. These are Gini coefficients on the y-axis. So if you don't know what that means, it's a measure between 0 and 1, kind of between complete equality and complete inequality. The bigger the number, the more inequality you have. So high numbers are bad, lower numbers are good. These are over the past, since the turn of the most recent century, 2 different data sources, Hilda data, and this is a survey of income and wealth, or survey of income and housing. And what you take away from this is that, if anything, inequality in wealth in Australia may be high, but it's declining. The 2 biggest components of inequality in wealth in Australia are superannuation in your houses. And so what I wanted to do was just show you what that looks like. The top is the housing wealth. It's kind of floating up a little bit, since about 2010. There's evidence here that this is coming down. There's no sharp increase. The bottom graph is the declining inequality in superannuation, which is exactly what you would expect as more and more Australians have access to the super guarantee. Okay, so that's clearly declining. So my takeaway from this is no real indicator that we've fallen off of a cliff or that things are changing, at least with respect to wealth. I regard wealth as a more important measure because that's what you have access to, right? Plenty of, income. People with small incomes live in wealthy households. And so what we really care about in terms of the resources you have access to, I think, as well. Okay, so everybody's feeling all right. Not exactly. This number, if you take away one number, the one that keeps me up at night, this is it. In 2022, 72% of Australians believe that a child born today will not do better than their parents. And if that doesn't worry you, what I can say is that the 1-year change between 2022 and 2021, 14 percentage points. Australia leads the world on this one. Leads the world in increasing pessimism about a child being born today being able to advance further than their parents. Now, it's not the wealth. There was nothing in that graph that showed you that wealth has changed. Of course, this is COVID, so maybe this is one of the consequences that we haven't really thought about with respect to the lockdowns. But what I can say is, even if it started to recover as a result of the economy opening up, we're not getting back to levels. I mean, look at, you know, we're standing squarely next to the US and the UK. So why does it feel like, you know, well, these are kind of perceptions of whether hard work is rewarded in Australia. You know, it won't surprise you to know that young people are less likely to think that hard work matters than old folks. But I think what's really striking about this is if you look at on the far left, that's 2013, the far right is 2023, so a decade. The age gap that we now have in 2023 did not exist in 2013, right? There was, you know, there's no particular age pattern. The sense of belonging in Australia by age, again, there's a big age gap. Young people don't feel they belong. They don't feel they're going to get ahead. They don't feel their children are going to get ahead. And they don't feel that hard work is being rewarded. All of that, I think, should give us pause. So why is that the case? Why does it feel like the social fabric's unraveling? Well, okay, maybe it's not all about money. This is a quote by Miles Korak, who is the architect of the Great Gatsby curve, which kind of shows you how inequality is related to economic opportunity across the world. And he just makes the point that, you know, it's not just monetary poverty that matters. What matters is experience and influence and expectation. And maybe it's not even all about housing wealth, right? We're hearing a lot about housing at the moment, and I can give you chapter and verse about why I think housing is the most important social policy issue that we need to be addressing. But I think it's, where we're looking is probably a little bit misguided, right? I'm not sure it's housing wealth, but more the precariousness or the affordability, the security and quality of housing. So I'm just going to tell you a quick little study. So this is the UK. In the UK, they are quite, well, increasingly social scientists are fond of pulling genetic data into our social science data. And what you can do with that is you can then do things like measure biological aging, not your chronological age, your biological age. How much stress have you experienced and how is that being expressed in your likelihood of dying, for example? And living in the UK rental market is associated with faster biological aging, and the effect is greater than the effect of experiencing unemployment or being a smoker. So it's not just statistical significance, it's actually meaningful. But social housing, despite the stigma that there might be in being in social housing, does not differ from home ownership. Now think about that, because the wealth differences in those two groups is extraordinary, right? If you are in social housing, you have no housing wealth. It looks like it's the precariousness of housing that really matters, and that there are psychological benefits of additional security, of tenure being provided to social tenants. Okay. So maybe it is about intergenerational fairness or perceived fairness. So Joe Stiglitz kind of reminds us that inequality is not inevitable. It's a result of policies and politics. And the question is then, if democracy's present focus, can it really achieve intergenerational fairness? And to what extent is Australian policy driving intergenerational inequality? And I'm, again, giving you a reference to some work that includes Peter MacDonald, amongst others, around intergenerational distributional issues in Australia, and the conclusion is policies driving inequality. So what do we think about going forward? I want to make a pitch. This is my attempt to take seriously, don't just admire the problem, but leave us with something to think about. My pitch is think about housing precariousness. It's multidimensional, it's policy driven. The debate in Australia is largely about what do we have to do to get people into houses. There's a shift in thinking around home ownership that needs to happen, and we need to be thinking about providing security for a group of individuals who may not build wealth through the purchase of housing.
Thanks very much. I also want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land, the Gadigal people, and I pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and see some familiar faces. And thank you so much for the invitation, Christina, to come here and talk in this very special place. So I'm going to talk about long-term environmental threats, and some of the stuff I'm talking about actually fits into what Her Excellency said this morning, and in particular what Paul said as well. So, and most of what I'm going to talk about is this figure here. I'll give you some more detail, and there's more detail to give you beyond the 10 minutes I've got. So there's two dimensions I have up here. So on the horizontal axis is what we're talking about today. You've got the democracies, the states that don't even function, the Hades of the world, for example, the pirate-type states. And then you have the autocracies, oligarchies, etc. You've got the illiberal democracies, as already mentioned, in context of Hungary. And then you move on to liberal democracy, which, of course, is ours, thankfully, in Australia. But we then keep on going to this idea of an active democracy, which Paul did talk to, and didn't bring up ancient Athens as well as Rome. So active democracy has deliberative democracy in it. It also has participatory democracy in it. And it's not just representative democracy. And again, Paul was very eloquent talking about that. It's not simply the matter that we go and vote in a federal election every 3 years or in New South Wales every 4 years. That is not what we're talking about in terms of active democracy. It has a whole series of things. He called it polycentricity or polycentric democracy. So let's look at the vertical axis. The vertical axis is those trade-offs, the socio-economic trade-offs, and we can debate about, is it a national level, is it at a particular group level in the context of housing and wealth, or is it particular individuals who have powerful interests and influence on how government makes decisions? It could be all of the above. We can talk about it in a context. And so what you see here is on the worst case. So the worst case is we've got a pirate-type state, no government, very high trade-offs in terms of doing something in relation to long-term environmental threats. Worst case, basically nothing happens. Okay, it's the destruction time, very sad. Move to the best case, the green little oval there, ellipse, low, relatively low. There always are trade-offs, as we know. There always are trade-offs. There are always winners and losers to some extent. And then you've got that active democracy. So what we're talking about here is a shift, if we can, if somehow whether we can wave our magic wands to move towards the best case. And so there are three hypotheses that I present. So in a paper that goes along with this presentation. So H1 is the first hypothesis. Is really about what Deborah and others were saying is this idea of trust in democracy, trust in who govern us. And there's certainly the reality, but there's also the perception that democracies aren't delivering for us. And that obviously was evident and manifest last week, but it's true in all sorts of other dimensions. It's true in Australia, for example, in the sense that we're shifting from the core parties, the two main political parties, to independents, for example. That clearly is a shift in terms of how we view how well we're being governed, for example, in a representative democracy. So we're shifting in the H1 from a liberal, and there's been multiple examples talked about today, shifting towards the illiberal democracy. I don't think we're heading to autocracies, even in the United States. Maybe that's my optimism, but we're certainly moving in the direction of a liberal democracy. I think the United States will be in a liberal democracy within 4 years, if you could argue the case now. So that's H1. H2 is really this issue. That's not a shift. It's saying where you are right now, the place in the world. And that really does determine our ability to act in the space of long-term environmental threats. Climate change, biodiversity loss, water insecurity, the three ones that I mentioned in the paper. So where we are along that horizontal line really does determine how our actions are effective or not, or actually we do something or we don't do something. And that is connected to the issue around liberal democracy and active democracy, because of the literature which is called regulatory capture. It began in the 1960s. It's a very large literature about how individual enterprises, organizations, and even individuals can capture, regulatory capture, that's what it's about, capture aspects of representative democracy. And we know how that works, okay? You have your lobbyists in Parliament at a state or federal level. All of the above, we can go into details. People in this room know much better than I do about that, but that's what I'm talking about. So that's where we are on the level. And then the third aspect of this, if we really want to do something about long-term environmental threats, and I'll give you just a flavor of some of that literature in a moment, and we must do something about that, then we need to have more active democracy. Because if you think about the balance at the moment, in my view, this is Australia. It's obviously worse in other countries. This is the balance in the context of the people, so to speak, in terms of their long-term interests vis-a-vis the short-term interests of a privileged few, if you want to call it that. And we need to, I don't say we'll ever get the balance, but we need to better balance. Because if we don't, and we've only got a short time available to us to do that because of climate change in particular, we're in big trouble. So 3 hypotheses. We can argue the point about whether it's true or not in all general cases, etc. Just want to highlight, because when I engage in this space, I say, well, people care about the economy, as Christina told us, is the economy stupid? Yes, of course they care about the economy, and of course that influenced votes last week in the United States of America, but they also care about long-term environmental threats, okay? To the extent that that goes up and down, that obviously is a function of a variety of things, but they also care in terms of how they're governed, and you can see those numbers there. Trust in government is low, vis-a-vis trust government is for a few big interests. That's 54% in the 2022 Australian electoral study, and meanwhile it's only 12%. That's not me, this is the Australian voters saying only 12% had felt that government's for all the people. That's the example I'm talking about. Whether you want to say it's real or perceived, that's certainly the perception. And so when you have that perception, then you look for alternatives, whether it's independence in a representative democracy like Australia, or you shift to more populist type leaders who will offer various solutions which will not be delivered on. And then on the right-hand side, my least right-hand side, you'll see the importance of the environment. Really, really important. I won't spend much time on climate change, you know it, but it is worth highlighting a couple of things. Okay, so the view has been that we would peak in terms of global CO2 emissions. I recall over a decade ago, people were predicting it before 2020. Well, 2024 came around, and yesterday the latest numbers say, no, it hasn't peaked in 2024, 0.8% increase. So it seems to be plateauing out. That's the good news, but it's still continuing to increase. A couple of other things to point out, although we don't know this, but there's certainly in 2024, we know the numbers now, we won't be confirmed for a couple of months. 2024 was the warmest year on record. The previous warmest year on record was 2023, and they are going beyond trend. It looks like climate change, global warming, is accelerating. We don't know, 2 years doesn't make a trend, but there is a lot of good science behind why that might be the case, in terms of deep ocean warming, for example. So if we look at where we're going, and I just want to stress this is a really big, long-term environmental threat for the entire world. This is from the International Energy Agency. Their stated policy scenario is not a projection, but it's more or less the sort of thing that you would equate to the business as usual or current trajectories. And it's worth highlighting what that's showing. That's where we're on, okay? And that doesn't mean dramatic falls. So even if we get a plateau in 2025, which would be the earliest year because it's not happening in 2024, we're not on the green line. So what does that mean? So what does it mean for net zero by 2050? Well, net zero by 2050 is, well, how to put it, I'm calling it greenwashing. Okay, so it's 25 years away now. A good part of net zero by 2050 in this country is about offsets. And I can tell you, the science tells you, if you don't already know this, the science tells you that an offset in terms of carbon sequestration is not the same as a reduction in emissions. All sorts of good reasons, scientific reasons. They're apples and oranges. We can't use that to claim net zero by 2050 in Australia. And that's true globally as well, for a whole series of reasons, which the literature is well versed on that. More importantly, or equally as important, even if we achieve net zero between 2030 and 2060, so look at A, which I've highlighted. So A is in the top left corner. We're still going to get, not in our lifetimes, no one here will live that long, but in the next 2 to 3 centuries, we will still get additional warming. In this case, 2 to 2.6 degrees, on top of the warming that we're already going to get when we get to net zero, which is going to be, in this case, if it's 2030 to 2060, is somewhere in the vicinity of 2 degrees. So it's 4 to 4.6. So net zero is greenwashing. Biodiversity loss, I would talk about that. There's the nature repair markets. Again, there's real issues around offsets, the ability to deliver what the Australian government has committed to, which are wonderful targets. But if you look at the numbers of what we're doing between 2011 and 2015 and in 2015 and 2020, we're not delivering. And that's a big turnaround that required. And I will argue, and I do argue in the paper, that there are a whole series of weaknesses in the approach that we're currently taking in Australia. And then the last but not least is the issues of water security, about how we've set up goals and targets, even by prime ministers from 2007, that we haven't been able to deliver on. And then the question then arises, well, is it because we're incompetent? Are Australians incompetent? We can't deliver on water reform? We can't deliver on we can't deliver on... No. I wish it were the case, but we're not incompetent. There's a lot of competence in this country, okay? This is the reason, again, up for argument. I would call it a climatocracy. There is a privileged few who are getting in the way of reform in the context of the action that is required, subject to the scale of the reform. There's a hydrocracy in the context of getting in the way of water reform in this country. And I even will call it a biodiversity. So there's relatively a small number of individuals, interests that are getting in the way in terms of our representatives, influencing them in all sorts of ways. And the outcome is we don't have the actions that we need to have in the time that we need to deliver it. Thank you.
In terms of time, I'm going to go straight to the floor for questions. I think we'll just take 2 questions in a row and then give our panel an opportunity to respond. So I've got one over there, yep, you, and I'll take one on that side, so 2.
I'm going to have mine first, but thank you. Professor Cobb-Clark, I hope I've got the name right. I get the comment you made about stability really hit home. Now, I grew up in Bankstown, and I owned the house and everything else, but Sorrent Street was all housing. Gould Street was all housing. Wilton Street was no housing. No one lived rough. The houses were basic, but then again, so was ours. All houses were basic. When the heck did government give up its responsibility of providing a roof over the heads of those who would never be able to own a property? We are one of the wealthiest countries in the world, and forgive the statement here. It is something I do not understand how we're taking a giant step backwards. And do you have any answers to how to get government involved again? Because I don't see the Building Housing Commission anymore.
Deborah, just before you answer that, I want to take the 2 in a row and then we'll come back to a response. So a question over here.
Better? Yeah. Better? I'm Danielle Moon. I'm a researcher in the law school at Macquarie University, and my question is for Professor Croft and Doctor, all of you that have any insight. So I research freedom of information law, and I was really interested in what you said about active participatory democracy. One of the interesting things that I found in my research is that people that are asking for information are seeking information before decisions are made to help them participate in those decisions. And that's at odds with the views of officials who see that requests should be made after decisions have been made as a method of accountability. And so they often resist freedom of information disclosure. So it's really interesting to me that people are seeking active participation in democracy and decision making. And I just wondered if you had any insights into how we could facilitate that, but also how we could change the culture of the public sector so that that's seen as a valuable contribution rather than a disruptor to decisions that have already been made.
Okay. Deborah, do you want to start? And then
I'm
Quentin
happy
and
to
Hugh may
start.
have
So I can't answer the question when, right? But at some point, we let go of social housing. And I think that is something that needs to be reconsidered, right? It's not the only way to provide stability. We could also tackle the lack of stability in the housing market. And I don't want to, I am going to tell you an anecdote. My youngest daughter is a teacher. She's decided that she thinks she's going to remain single and she wants to live in Sydney. And she is in the pointy end of the market. She's in the share market. She has no lease. She's never had a lease. She can be tossed out at a moment's notice. And those sorts of lack of regulation around that and choices around social housing, all of that is, was done by policy, and so presumably it could be undone by policy. The focus, there is an ethos of home ownership, which may be changing, right? Young people are well aware that they are going to struggle to aspire to what their parents had, and somebody said to me, you're not going to fix Sydney. You cannot fix Sydney's housing market. What I think we need to be thinking about is ways of being creative to provide long-term stability, proper housing that doesn't necessarily involve home ownership. And I take exactly your point, right? Housing, if you look at the UN human rights, housing's on the list.
Thanks, Danielle, for the really good question. Of course, there's a former senator who's doing a lot of FOIs on behalf of a bunch of different people because he knows how to do them and he does it well. Look, I think the people are switching off from democracy because they don't feel democracy is delivering for them, and I talk about that in a general sense, not in the focus of Australia, but there is a very extensive literature talking about deliberative democracy. And in some sense, Athens was that type of democracy, if you want to use that terminology. And so, citizens' assembly, citizens' juries, and you can do this through online platforms, and it has been done through what they call them deliberatora. So what the literature tells us is that when people believe, and that's a reality behind that perception, that their engagement brings change, as in they're listened to, then people do engage. And the reason people aren't voting when they don't have compulsory voting is exactly they're switching off. They don't think it makes a difference. That's obviously, I think, what I think is going on, at least the main reason. I'd also highlight that the processes to move towards, active democracy does include deliberative democracy, but it also includes participatory democracy, which Paul talked about this morning. And participatory democracy, when I talked about the balance in my presentation, that's really about dialogue. So there's a literature on dialogue, okay, which is reflection and then action. So dialogue's not conversation, it's not consultation, and it's not focus group. And so what dialogue is about is you get people involved. Not everybody can be directly involved, but people involved who set up, or they can be, you know, from a random sampling, population, etc. They get involved, and they are on ongoing basis for key decisions. I'm not saying for every single decision, you know, but there are key decisions. You know, whether it's a national security decision about AUKUS, you know, that should be part of whether you're for it or against it. That should have been part of a participatory deliberatory process, or whether it's climate change and the action, that should be part of the process. And obviously the way Australia works, it's a representative democracy. Our representatives will make the call. I get that and I accept that. But they need to make the call with that sort of information set that's available and transparent to all. And if they want to make the call that supports, you know, a particular interest group, go ahead and do it. And people have spoken, said something else. And then, you know, we have the balancing and the context of the next election. But what's hidden at the moment is the obscurity. And that's why the FOIs are so important. It's obscure. Who got to see what, you know? Yes, there's information in New South Wales. It's good that that information is not available, at least it wasn't recently, on the federal level. That's the sort of information we need. That's why people argued, you know, for 90% plus for, you know, National Integrity Commission. That's what people want, because they want to have, as Paul told us, you know, polycentric type, you know, structures. So that's what we need. and it ain't going to happen unless we as in the people, as people, argue for it and go for it, because the representatives in general will not bring about that change by themselves.
Thanks, Quentin. Hugh, do you want to have any final comments? No. Look, we could have continued the discussion for a very long time, but we are out of time. And I think, you know, we've had three very different but ultimately very complementary perspectives on the different facets of challenges that we face with democracy. I mean, it strikes me that democracy is a very strong concept, but it rests on rather fragile institutions and structures. And listening to our three presentations, it's a combination of clarity and complexity. I mean, the trend lines that Hugh and Deborah and Quentin described are quite clear in their conclusions, but what you do about them from a policy point of view and from a political point of view is much more complicated. And it really brings us back to the point that the governor made in her speech this morning, which is that at the end of the day, politics is at the heart of democracy. And I don't mean that in a dismissive sense, as in, you know, a plague on all politicians. I mean that unless we rediscover the way to align good policy and good politics, because I think we have lost that art over the last, pick your timeline. Hugh says 25. That may be a bit more pessimistic, but unless we rediscover the ability to align good policy with good politics, we will be burdened with the success of populism. And the bottom line definition of populism is that bad policy is good politics, and we're heading in that direction at a rate of knots. So. I want to thank Hugh and Deborah and Quentin for outstanding contributions to our panel discussions, and I'd ask you to join me in thanking them.